Welcome to Office Hours with Peter Hanink. So today I'm going to answer one of the questions that I get most often, I think, from my students. This is a question I get a lot in class, and this is a question I get a lot in office hours. And that question is, how do we know that something is discrimination? Specifically, I get this a lot when I'm dealing with racial discrimination. Most obviously, I get this when I'm looking at things like stop and frisks, things like driving while black, things like police violence. And the question that students ask me so often is, okay, so we know something seems to be going on. There do seem to be some differences, but does that mean that there's actually discrimination? Does that mean there's actually something wrong? So to answer this, I'm going to do what I do with all my students, and that is I'm going to try to get at some definitions. And the first definition I want to get at is, what do we mean by a disparity? Then I want to talk about, what do we mean by discrimination? And is it possible to have one without the other? And what exactly does that mean? So first off, what is a disparity? A disparity, as in like disparity, as in not parity, as in not equal, is when we notice a difference between two things. Now, what kind of differences could we notice? Well, let's take a very simple example. Let's look at a small town and say in that small town, 10 black people were stopped and 10 white people were stopped. There we would see no difference in the absolute numbers of the people who were stopped. And we say, okay, there's no difference in the absolute numbers, so everything's fine, right? Well, maybe it is. But in order to understand whether a difference or lack of difference means that everything is good, or maybe that there are problems, we have to understand, well, compared to what? And this is something I talked a lot about in my podcast episode about responding to Sam Harris. But I really want to dive deeper here. And what I want to dive deeper into is this idea of, what do we do with numbers and how do we make sense of them? So again, going back to this hypothetical town where 10 black people are stopped and 10 white folks are stopped. And we say, okay, well, is that a problem, or does that mean everything's okay because the numbers are absolutely the same? Well, if 50% of the town was black and 50% of the town was white, then we would say there's an equal number of blacks and whites in this town, and there's an equal number of stops. So we'd say there, that's parity, right? Everything's equal. But if we find out that there are 10 stops of African Americans and there are 20 African Americans in this town, and there are 10 stops of white folks, and there's 100 white folks in this town, then that starts to look more troubling, because 10 out of 20 is 50%, and 10 out of 100 is only 10%. So it looks like African Americans are being stopped at a higher rate. This would be a disparity. So here we saw no difference in the absolute number of stops, but now we see a difference statistically when we look at the stop rates. Okay, so we see a disparity. Does that mean automatically there's discrimination? Right, that's the question that we always want to understand. That's the question that leads to lawsuits. That's the question that leads to protests. That's the question that leads to people calling for police reform. So just because there's a disparity, does that mean that there's discrimination? So what is discrimination? At its most basic level, discrimination isn't a bad thing. It's one of the things that's really tricky about trying to talk about these things sometimes, is that these words have taken on such loaded meanings frequently. And so when we say discrimination, automatically people assume there must be some sort of bad motive, or assume people must be prejudiced, or assume people's hearts must be filled with hate. And that's not really what discrimination means. I'll give you an example. Despite her insistence over and over again that she's an excellent driver, the state of California refuses to let my 3-year-old get a driver's license. So is that discrimination? Yeah. 3-year-olds can't get driver's licenses. No 3-year-old. You could be the best driver in the world, and if you're 3 years old, you're not getting a driver's license. Is that discrimination? Yes. Now, do we think that that's discrimination is a problem? Probably not. Why? Well, we think that there might be something innate about young children that might make them bad drivers, that might make them problematic as drivers, that might make it unsafe. And so we've decided as a public policy not to let young people drive, specifically very young people. And I'm sure none of you want my 3-year-old to be driving, right? So it's good, right? But it starts to get trickier, because what about a 15-year-old? What about a 14-year-old? What about a 13-year-old? Clearly, there might be some 13-year-olds or some 14-year-olds who are responsible, safe drivers, just as we know, all of us know, that there are 25-year-olds that are terrible drivers that should not be driving. So we start to see, okay, maybe that's getting us closer to what we worry about with age discrimination. Age is a really tricky one, though, and the courts have consistently found that age is one of the things that people can discriminate against in certain contexts, specifically about what's referred to as reaching the age of majority, reaching the age of adulthood, saying that, once you're 18, certain rights kick in, but before that, you don't get those rights. Or once you're 21, certain rights kick in, but before that, you don't get those rights. And one of the reasons behind that is we kind of all recognize that, yeah, you're a kid, but you grow out of it, right? Eventually, you'll get the rights. Eventually, you'll be old enough where you can do all of the things that full citizens can do. When it becomes more troubling is when we're talking about things that are referred to sometimes as immutable characteristics. That's things about you that you can't change or shouldn't be expected to change. Things like, obviously, your skin color. Things like your race, things like your sex. Those are things about you that are innate to you that you either can't change or no one should force you to be able to change, right? No one should force you to change. Well, another example of an immutable characteristic that could give rise to discrimination, but the kind of discrimination that maybe we don't really have a problem with, is, let's again stick with this example of driving. How about people who are completely blind? People who are completely blind cannot get driver's licenses and cannot drive. And that is an immutable characteristic, right? They're not going to get their vision back tomorrow. Is that discrimination? Yes. Right? There's a whole list of things that people can't do because they're legally blind. And we don't necessarily think that that's a problem. Now, when does it become a problem? Well, it becomes a problem, and this is exactly what the American with Disabilities Act is about, when maybe people who are blind could do certain things if we maybe changed the way things were done or gave them what are known as reasonable accommodations. So even though people who are legally blind or people who have very limited eyesight, maybe there's no set of accommodations that's going to get it to the point where we would hire that person as a bus driver. But certainly there might be ways that they can have software that can read to them so that people who are even though they're blind can fully participate in college classes, can fully participate in the job force, in the labor force, as long as there are reasonable accommodations that are made. So we get this idea that discrimination by itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? It's treating different things differently. Where we start to worry about it is when something else might be going on. And that something else that might be going on is known as bias. Now, bias, for those of you who've taken statistics and those of you who are familiar with statistics, the common definition of bias is systematic non-random error, right? That's things are different from what we'd expect. There's an error, and it's systematic, right? And it's non-random. Because there's always going to be a little bit of error that's random error, right? The kind of noise. But where we worry about bias is when the error seems to be always going in the same direction. And I know that that's a really kind of maybe an abstract way of talking about it. But to make it real, this would where we would say if half the town were white and half the town were black, we would expect equal numbers of people to be pulled over. But if we find out that all the people being pulled over are black, then that error seems to be pointing in one direction and one direction only. And that is where we worry about bias creeping in, and that bias might be transforming a disparity into discrimination. Now, what do you do with that, right? How do you prove bias. That's really tricky, and that's one of the things that the courts have consistently had trouble with. And the Supreme Court, especially the U.S. Supreme Court, has said disparities, statistical differences, are not enough to prove discrimination. In order to prove discrimination, you have to have evidence not just that's consistent with discrimination, but dispositive of discrimination. So evidence that's consistent with discrimination would be things like those disparities that I talked about earlier, right? Where it looks like, African Americans are being stopped at a higher rate than white folks. Well, those differences in rates, those disparities, are consistent with discrimination, but they're not dispositive of it. Why? Well, consistent means that it doesn't prove it false, right? It doesn't rule it out. So you have consistent evidence. So you have evidence that's consistent with discrimination. So you're like, okay, well, we can keep going forward. But does that mean you've proven discrimination? No, it just means you haven't disproven it. How do you prove it? Well, that's where you need evidence that's dispositive of discrimination. And dispositive, what we mean is that it rules out alternatives, that it shows that it's not something else. That's the kind of evidence that's going to make you think, okay, this is not just random. This is not just explained by something else. This seems to really have something going on. And that something going on, maybe we'll call it discrimination. So what kind of evidence would be dispositive of discrimination? A very famous study that was done years ago looked at the behavior of different kinds of law enforcement agencies. And specifically what it looked at was the behavior of local law enforcement agencies, kind of local police departments, in the ways in which they stopped motorists, as opposed to the highway patrol. So you think about a local police department, right? Your local police department, your local sheriff's department, when they make a stop, right? What kind of context is that stop occurring in versus the highway patrol, right? What kind of context is that stop occurring in? I live in California, and there's, hundreds and hundreds of police departments, but there's only one highway patrol, the California Highway Patrol. What do? They drive up and down the freeways. Well, what's different about the freeways from local surface streets? Well, local surface streets, you're probably going pretty slow, right? You're probably going, 20, 30, 40 miles per hour. As opposed to highway patrol, you're driving, maybe 60, 70 miles per hour, 80 miles per hour. So the argument there was, well, if we want to prove that discriminations might be going on in the rates at which people are being stopped, specifically racial and ethnic minorities are being stopped, one of the ways that we can get at that would be to look at the differences between the local PD and the highway patrol. And what did they find? They found that local police departments were stopping African-American motorists at a higher rate than the highway patrol was. What does that demonstrate? Well, obviously, it doesn't prove everything, right? But it gets you part of the way there. And part of the reason is, what I'm sure you can imagine, one of the differences is that when people are driving slow, it's easier to identify them, right? It's easier to identify the race of the driver versus, if you're a highway patrol officer sitting in a speed trap and a car zooms by you at 60 miles per hour, you probably can't see the race of the driver. And since you can't see the race of the driver, you're not going to be able to say that was a black guy that went by, I should stop him. Or, that's a white guy who went by, I shouldn't stop him. Right? So even if a highway patrol officer wanted to discriminate on the basis of race, it would be really hard for them to do so. Versus there's much more opportunity for a local police department to do it. Another interesting example of how we can test for this is a really clever experiment. And it's one that's been replicated in cities around the country. I replicated it when I was looking at a mid-sized city in the mountain states. I've replicated when I've looked at cities here in Southern California. And what that is to look at the twilight hours. So what are the twilight hours? So this kind of approach, which is sometimes referred to as a veil of darkness approach, says, okay, something special happens during the course of the year. And that something special that happens is that sometimes during the year, 5 p.m. is dark. And sometimes during the year, 5 p.m. is bright day. And what this approach assumes is that, generally speaking, people's driving behavior, their patterns of driving, probably don't change much throughout the year, especially in a place like Southern California where we don't have to worry about snow, right? At 5 p.m., I'm going to drive home from work. I'm going to drive home from work at 5 p.m. regardless of whether it's day or night, regardless of whether it's dark or light. So what this approach does is it says, well, let's look at the rate at the proportion, right, the percentage of the drivers who are stopped when it's bright out at 5 p.m. and compare that the percentage of drivers who are stopped when it's bright out, when it's dark out at 5 p.m., right? So compare the 5 p.m. during the summer months to the 5 p.m. during the winter months. And we see, okay, this approach would say it looks like 30% of the drivers who are stopped in the summer months are African American when it's bright out, but only 20% of the drivers who are stopped when it's dark out are African American. What does this suggest? Well, this suggests that the race of the driver seems to be playing some role in the decision of the person to stop them, right? Now, obviously, those kinds of approaches are complicated, and maybe you're having trouble following it, right? Maybe it's confusing. And I'll post the links below so you can read those papers if you're interested in more trying to understand exactly what's going on. But ultimately, a lot of what's going on with this issue of can I prove discrimination just because we have disparities is, again, as I said, trying to rule out alternate causes, of trying to show that evidence is dispositive. And one of the ways you do that is you try to control. Right? That's the phrase that gets used a lot, is we're trying to control for other variables. So one of the things that I've mentioned before in videos, and I certainly always mention in class, is when we say, okay, this kind of very simplified example of a town that I gave you, where we have 10 African Americans being stopped and 10 white folks being stopped. Well, one of the really important questions that we should be asking is not just what are the numbers of people being stopped, but whether those numbers are appropriate or not. And the only way to know that is compared to what? So that's where we look at some kind of baseline. We want to try to understand compared to what? If there is a disparity, right? If it's not equal, what is it not equal to? And a classic kind of example would be to compare the number of people who are stopped to the number of people who meet that group, say men, say minorities, what have you, to their percentage in the population. But there, as you can imagine, there's also problems, right? Because we'd say, okay, well, fine, maybe we're stopping African Americans at a higher rate than the percentage that are in the population. But maybe, as is frequently the answer given by police departments, it's because they live in higher crime neighborhoods, right? There's more crime. So we're stopping them more, not because of who they are, but we're stopping them because maybe of where they are, right? So we're doing more stops in high crime neighborhoods. And because we're doing more stops in high crime neighborhoods, we're going to catch more people who live in those neighborhoods. And since racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to live in high crime neighborhoods than whites are, we're going to end up stopping more racial and ethnic minorities than we do stopping whites. And that, of course, is an empirical question, right? You can measure that. And one of the ways that I've measured that in the past, when I looked at New York City and the rates at which New York City the New York City Police Department stops people of different races, was to look at, try to control for what is the crime rate in that neighborhood. Is it really true, right? Is that really what seems to be driving it, right? Is it just dependent upon crime rate, or is there something else going on? And what I found when I looked at New York City was that even when you controlled for crime, even when he controlled for poverty, even when he controlled for all these other things that people suggest might explain the differences and disparities in the rates at which people are stopped, what we see is that still it looks like neighborhoods that have more black people get more stops. Specifically, what I found in New York City was that neighborhoods that have more poor black folks experience more stops than other neighborhoods. And that's something that's been found in many cities around the country, that kind of pattern. And that's part of the reason why criminologists and people who study crime are so confident when we say there does seem to be something going on to these ideas of driving while black. There does seem to be something going on when we talk about differences in the rates at which African Americans are stopped by the police, or have force used against them by the police, or are killed by the police. We say we don't just look at the absolute numbers, right? 10, 12. And we don't even necessarily just look at the percentages. But we try to figure out compared to what. And establishing that baseline is often the thing that's tricky. But that is one of the main ways that we can show that disparities are actually resulting in discrimination. But there's another wrinkle here. Up to this point, we've been talking about what might be called individual micro-level discrimination. Micro-level meaning person-by-person level discrimination. This is the kind of discrimination that we're most used to talking about, right? This is the kind of discrimination that we think about when we talk about bigots, when we talk about people who are racists. We talk about individuals making individual prejudiced decisions, biased decisions, bigoted decisions. That when we talk about intentional racism, conscious racism, this is the level that we're talking about. And to be clear, even when we talk about what might be called implicit bias, it's still an individual level phenomenon. But there's something else at play, and that's what might be called a macro level phenomenon. So individual level phenomena would be about individual officers making biased decisions. Individual officers operating out of their own personal prejudices, choosing to pull someone over because of who they are, their characteristics, because of their race, because of their sex, because of their whatever. But there's also a macro level effect. And when we talk about systemic racism or institutional racism, we're not talking about the conscious individual micro-level racism of racists. We're talking about a kind of racism that can occur, as Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls it, without racists. Right? We can have racism without racists. How? Well, let's think about this for a second. Go back to the example of stops. One of the things that we said about stops was that when we're trying to figure out whether there's discrimination at play, we might look at control variables. And one of the control variables that I mentioned that police departments frequently point to when they look at disparities is the crime levels that might be occurring in individual jurisdictions or precincts or neighborhoods. And they'll say, oh, there's a lot of stops here because there's a lot of crime here. And in that way, police departments frequently say, look, we are employing race-neutral reasons, right? We have race-neutral rationale for our behavior. Yes, you're detecting disparities. Yes, you're detecting differences. But those differences and those disparities are not the result of individual discrimination. They're not the result of individual racism. Rather, they're the result of these race-neutral explanations. So why are there so many stops going on here? Well, because there's a lot of crime here. What's at play here is what sometimes gets referred to as discrimination laundering. Or at least that's the concern. So what would discrimination laundering mean? What would that look like? Well, one of the most famous examples of statistics-based policing can be found in New York City with the New York Police Department with a program called COMPSTAT. And COMPSTAT, which is short for computer statistics, is a very sophisticated software analysis platform that looks at crime statistics and says, okay, well, there seems to be a lot of crime here, so this is where we need to deploy the police. So why did we have so many stops in this neighborhood? Because there's a lot of crime here, and that's why we deployed a lot of police there. Well, how did you know there was a lot of crime there? Because in the past, you made a lot of arrests there. And how did you know to send the police there? Because in the past, the statistics told you that's where the crime was. And do you see the problem? The concern is that we have what's coming out of these statistical analyses is race neutral, right? We're sending the police here, we're deploying the police to this neighborhood because that's where the statistics tell us the crime is occurring. But where did those statistics come from? Well, let's get the old joke about, right, like the world is resting upon a turtle, and what's the turtle resting on? Another turtle, and what's below that? Another turtle, and it's turtles all the way down. The kind of infinite regress. Well, there might be something similar at play, right? So why did you send the police there? Because that's where the crime is. And how'd you know that's where the crime is? Because that's where we sent the police before, right? There's a kind of a circle here, right? And hopefully you see the issue. The reason why this is called discrimination laundering is if somewhere down that chain, and to be really clear, you could go back really far. It might be that you'd have to go back years or decades to find the micro-level, individual-level racists. But if, at some point, far in the past, whatever that is, right, you had a number of you had enough of these individual micro-level racists who decided that they were going to target certain neighborhoods because they were black, target certain neighborhoods because they were poor. And that's how you establish that first record, right? Those first cases, which were enough to get this neighborhood to be determined to be a high crime neighborhood. Then that gets fed in to the statistical analysis, and the output is now been laundered of any racism, right? The output of saying, oh, this is where we should send the police is just based upon the cold application of numbers, right? No more racism there. But the effect of it, right, is these racial disparities in police stops and racial disparities in all the other things we're concerned about, like use of force and police killings. And the inputs that were originally driving that could, in fact, be racist. There's lots of other ways in which, obviously, systemic racism operates, but this is one that is particularly concerning, and it's particularly concerning because it can be so hard to detect. And, to be really clear, well-meaning, well-intentioned police chiefs, captains, officers can say, none of us are racist, and we're not engaged in racist behavior. Our behavior is being driven by these numbers, and that's all it is. But you have to ask the question, where did those numbers come from, right? If we're saying, okay, the stops that we're conducting in 2020 were based upon arrests in 2019. Well, why did you make those arrests in 2019? Because that's where we sent the police, because that's where the crime was in 2018. And all the way back. So that can be another way in which we can say, okay, we see disparities. Maybe we can't prove individual level discrimination, but what this still might look like in effect, and what it still might be, is this macro level discrimination, this systemic discrimination, right? This systemic racism, this institutional racism, the kind of racism that can operate without racists. Thanks a lot. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, subscribe, and I'll be posting more of these office hour questions. If you have a question that you'd like to ask in office hours, please go ahead and put it in the comment section, and I'll take a look, and maybe I'll answer it. Bye.